If you're like me and probably the vast majority of Helix users, we use our Helix as our main guitar processor. We set up presets, we use it with one guitar, we get some great sounds out of it, some very flexible routing, the ability to add and route effects in a lot of creative ways. But something that a lot of folks may not be aware of is the Helix can be used in a much more powerful way, almost like a full-fledged mixer with the ability to process many different sounds. You might ask how we can do that. Without further ado, let's dive over to HX Edit. And I hope I'm able to open some eyes to some folks that are maybe even longtime Helix users to spark some new ideas and realize that there's possibly even more power in the Helix than we first thought. All right, so here we are over at HX Edit. You see I have a blank preset, nothing going on in it. One thing I wanted to show you really quick is this use of paths. And there's probably a lot of folks who've done things like this where maybe they will just add a reverb and then maybe, let's say, add a delay and yank the delay down onto a parallel path. So creating this second path, maybe they just don't want their delay to be processed by the reverb, so they're going to have route it around. That's fine. That's a perfectly valid way to use it. What a lot of folks maybe don't realize, though, is we can also do things like this. Let's just add an amp and cab here and go to one of my favorites, which is the Matchstick Channel 2. I'm going to copy that and I'm going to add it again. You might wonder why I'm doing that. Well, watch what I'm going to do with this. I'm going to yank this down onto the second path. Now you might say, well, this isn't really doing anything great for us. But if I was to grab our little split block here and drag it down also, it creates a completely separate path now. And I could also go back over here to my merge path and pull it down and complete a completely separate path that's completely unrelated to the top path if we make a few settings correctly. So let's say that we wanted to run, for instance, two completely separate guitarists through one Helix. A lot of folks may think, well, that's not possible, but it absolutely is. Obviously, we are going to be limited by the amount of processing power. Now, just to keep in mind, when we have a normal path A and path B as the Helix comes up as default, each of those paths are running on one of the processor chips within the Helix. So when I pull something down from path A, as I did here with 2 amps, these two are still running off of that first processor. This path down here is going to be on a completely separate processor. So we could also have run this down here, but we'll get to that in a moment. So now I've got two separate guitar rigs, let's call them. Identical, really. And they're both coming into a guitar input. Now, that's not really going to do us much good because both of these paths are going to be processed by my guitar, which is plugged into the guitar input. But what if we came over here and left this as the guitar input, and we came to this other guitar input, but changed that to return 1. Now, a return is just another way of saying input, really. We're returning the signal in. Now, it's very important here if you're going to plug a guitar into one of the returns to go into the global settings and set that to instrument level, which I have already done. So return is set to instrument level. Now, for this video here, what I've done is I'm using my radial shotgun guitar splitter. So I'm sending the signal of my guitar into that, splitting it out, one going into the guitar input of the Helix and one going into the return 1. So both of these are getting this guitar being played, but into separate inputs, because I want to see if there's any sound difference between the two. So basically, if we had two guitarists, one plugged into our guitar input on our Helix and one plugged into the return 1 with it set to instrument level, we can now process two different guitar players playing through the Helix. One thing to be said about that, though, is the return 1 player will get an input gate, but will not get the guitar pad or guitar input impedance settings. So this could potentially be a problem if we were running a block that really required the impedance to be set maybe with the auto setting on the Helix. So if you notice here, I'm just setting this to our 1 mega ohm setting to match what I feel the return 1 is going to be also when set to instrument. So we now have my guitar feeding two separate inputs on the Helix, and we want to see if these sound different. So what we can do is we go to snapshot 1. We're going to go to our multi-out here, and we're going to enable snapshots on both of these. And on snapshot 1, I'm going to have the path 1B turned down to -120, while path 1A will be at 0 dB. But when I switch to snapshot 2, I'm going to have path 1A go down to -120 and path 1B stay at 0. So now when I switch between the snapshots, you'll notice that one will be audible and the other will not. So this will tell us if we're going to get the same sound out of both. So going to snapshot 1, we are listening to path 1A, snapshot 2, we're listening to path 1B, plugged into different inputs. So here's the sound of path 1A. Switching over to path 1B. Let me just play and switch back and forth. Watch up here to see which snapshot we're on. Did you hear any sound difference? They're extremely close, if not the same. So it kind of shows we could actually process a whole other guitar player through a separate path by using one of our return inputs set to instrument level. Now, the only problem here is, let's say we wanted to come and say, I'm going to add a little bit of reverb to both of these paths. And I come over here and I copy this and I try to paste it down here. It doesn't let me because I'm out of processing power. So one way around that would simply be to drag this guy down to this path, set this to the return 1 setting we had before. I want to maybe get rid of these snapshots that we had set up because we've already listened that they sound pretty much the same, or, you know, close enough that we could dial something in that's going to work for us. Now we could copy and paste that same setting in there. Now we're hearing both of them because they're both turned up. And we could even add in a little transistor tape echo maybe. Copy that. And we end up with a couple little guitar rigs that are completely separate from one another that 2 guitar players could be playing through. One going into the guitar input, one going into the return 1. Now you might say, well, what about the outputs of these? Where are they going to go to? Well, if we were recording, we could set one to record on USB 1.2 and one to record on USB 3.4 and have a whole separate multi-track copy of each, with one guitar player in one path, another in the other path, and both paths being fed out to a different destination in our DAW. If we were playing live, we could set one to 1/4 inch and one to XLR, or we could set the appropriate setting to line, let's say, for one of our sends and just use our send outputs instead and have them go to separate places. Or we could have them both sent to the same place, depending on what our needs are. So extremely flexible. Now, let's say that we did have this set up so that one was going to XLR, one was going to 1/4 inch out, but we had more instruments we needed to worry about. Maybe we had a vocal track. Well, what we could do is we could come here, we could add like a simple mono gain block. We can yank that down, go to our split block, yank that down, go to our merge block, yank that down. Set this to our mic input. We could process this path in whatever way is left for it to be processed, right? Meaning, do we still have some reverb? Maybe we want a little bit of compression on it. We add an LA Studio comp into it, and maybe we want a dab of reverb. Look at that. We can still process it, and we want that one to go out our, send 1.2 because we've already used the XLR and 1/4 inch here. The other thing we could do as well is set both of these to XLR and then pan one to the left and one to the right if we are just simply using mono. Then one will go out the left XLR, one will go out the right XLR, and they won't really interfere with each other. So another really handy use. Obviously, this would have to be turned up. So very, very handy stuff and something that's very good to know. But so now we could process a completely separate path for our mic. Let's say we had a keyboard player in the band as well. We could do a similar thing. Just grab, in this instance, let's say we want it to be stereo. Stereo gain block, pull that down, pull our split and merge blocks down. Maybe we're going to have our keyboard put into return 3-4, and we'd go to our global settings and set those to line inputs. And then we have those two guys coming out of our send 3-4. And now we've processed two separate guitar players, one on guitar input, one on return 1. We have our mic input being processed however we want. And now we have our keyboards being processed. Again, we could add whatever is still available from our available FX blocks. So I wanted to cover that because I know there's a lot of folks that are aware we can do split paths, you know, like I said, maybe to do parallel processing so that a delay doesn't go through the reverb in its process, it goes around it. But to actually treat each of the 4 stereo paths as completely independent separate paths that could process completely different instruments. Having 2 guitarists play through 2 simple guitar rigs while processing a vocal mic and a keyboard, or whatever the connections will allow us to add in there, making sure we go to the global settings and change the instrument and line levels to the appropriate settings for whatever the situation is. I can't give you that answer today because it's really going to depend on what situation you're using it for. I hope I covered that well, and I hope that was a bit of an eye-opener to some folks, and I hope it sparks some new uses for your Helix that maybe you didn't know were there. Thanks so much for tuning in. I really appreciate you sharing your time with me. Please like the video and share it with anybody you think would get some use or enjoyment out of watching it. And also, please subscribe to the channel and hit the little bell notification to get notified when I put new content out. I'll be back really soon with some more. Thank you guys again so much for tuning in. Ciao for now.